There's two ways of defining poverty. One is in absolute terms, and we have definitions like somebody living on $1 or $2 a day or less, that's considered poor. And then there are in relative terms, and that's in relation to the middle level in a country, the median level, or the distribution of income in a country. And that's more to do with the inequality of income in a country. So maybe somebody is living on $3 a day, but then they might be considered poor if they live in the UK, for example, where the average standard of living is higher. I think there is still a lot of poverty in Britain, but clearly Britain has a social welfare net that helps alleviate the worst symptoms of poverty. So I think for people who don't fall through the net, if you like, poverty or the worst symptoms of poverty are kind of alleviated to some degree. So I think Britain, I mean, compared to other industrialized countries, for example, the United States, is not doing too badly in terms of its social safety nets, etc. For example, you have a health service which is accessible to everyone, irrespective of their level of income. I think we're better off as a result of that. I think access to health, to basic health, should be for everyone, not just for the rich. I think a lot can be done to alleviate poverty, and a lot more than we have done so far. But clearly, a lot of things have to happen. If the rich continue to get away by causing crisis and being bailed out and continue to enrich themselves, I can't see how we're going to be addressing poverty. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that if you want to alleviate poverty, besides the kind of microeconomic policies that are great policies, focusing on health, education, etc., I think the banking systems should be banking systems that actually work for the benefit of a whole economy, not just for the benefit of a few financial oligarchs, whatever it is you want to call them. Once you address that, then the banking system can play a much more important role. And we see in many countries actually where ownership structures of banks are not the kind of the same as, for example, in the US and Britain, that banks or financial institutions there have done a wonderful job. And I'm referring to microfinance institutions, for example, but also cooperatives, credit cooperatives. I think credit cooperatives are a very much neglected kind of financial institution in the system, but they have done quite a lot of work in many developing countries, but also in Europe, in helping small companies, in helping people acquire homes and build houses, etc. And I think they are forms of ownership that should be looking at more closely. But also, one other form of ownership that we should be looking at more closely is what we have at the moment in Britain, government ownership of banks. I think private ownership of banks has brought a lot of cost to us. Now, government ownership can bring some benefit to the taxpayer, and I'd like to see the government-owned banks being used effectively to promote the economic well-being of people in this country and elsewhere, wherever we have government ownership of banks. I hope that we will see reform of the fund. We will see an international monetary fund that is more legitimate and is more representative and has the interest of the whole world at heart rather than the interest of one superpower. Banks and financial institutions in general can play a very important role in promoting economic development, in promoting investment, in promoting small companies, in basically lending money to people to educate themselves and improve their human capital. They can actually play a very, very important role as long as they're not sidetracked into activities that are aimed towards enriching the insiders. Unfortunately, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen quite a lot of that and not enough of the more traditional ways of financing development, which I think we have to really go back to. I mean, it's not that there hasn't been finance for development in the last 10 to 15 years, but what there has been is a lot of emphasis by lots of banks around the world on policies that were aimed at mainly promoting the well-being of bank insiders, not even the bank shareholders. The bank shareholders actually took a very big hit from the financial crisis, and the same is true of the taxpayer, who has bailed out in the end the banks. The policies that we have had in place in the last 20 to 30 years at the international level, they're perhaps not the best policies that we could have had. They are policies that to some extent were intended to address poverty, but I refer to the role that has been played, for example, by the IMF and the World Bank in promoting policies like financial liberalization to developing countries. Those sort of policies haven't really worked very well, but they have certainly enriched financiers, banks and international banks, etc. If we have had better macroeconomic policies, we could have seen better results in developing countries. If the IMF and the World Bank and other organizations have worked with these countries to develop policies that work in those particular settings, and were not so keen to push the policies that promoted the interests of the big American banks, for example, we would have seen better poverty alleviation. But we now have an opportunity in the aftermath of the crisis, I think, to reform the international financial system, to reform the IMF, to reform the World Bank, and to aim for better policies that would help lift more people out of poverty. At the macroeconomic level, and I'm not referring to micro level policies, which would be things like infrastructure projects, education improvements, improvements in health, new hospitals, etc. Those are obviously wonderful policies and they should continue, right? But when we're talking at the macroeconomic level, how to manage macroeconomies, I think we're looking at a much deeper reassessment of macroeconomic theory and policy, starting from what central banks are trying to do, starting from interest rate policies, and starting to what we're trying to do with the banking systems of these countries and with the international banking system. And there, I would think that we should, if possible, regulate banks, international banks, very differently to what we have done in the past, and try and focus them more on the kind of more traditional types of banking that have actually been quite good in developing economies in the past, in the sense of lending for investment. That's important, lending to private companies for investment, rather than unfettered financial liberalization, whereby everyone can just basically buy any financial asset wherever it's coming from and enrich themselves essentially by speculation. The enormous bonuses of bankers that they have, if anything, encourage them to speculate. All that has to change, in my view. What I would like to see is a reform of the International Monetary Fund and the reform of the World Bank to make them both more representative of the world we're living in today, in which there are countries like China and India and developing world who are not really represented enough. I would like to see those organizations becoming more legitimate, right? Because their legitimacy clearly has taken lots of blows in the last 10, 15, 20 years. They're not seen by the developing world in particular, and by the poor in the world in general, as the organizations that are aimed at lifting the poor out of poverty, even though it is one of the missions of the World Bank to do so. So I would like to see major change there on the international level, and I would also like to see financial regulation all over the world, not allowing the kinds of things that we've seen in the last 10 years to have happened. And what I mean, allowing banks to speculate, allowing these enormous bonuses, for bankers, with the pretext that well, it's their own business anyway, it's their own profits. Well, we clearly have seen that it was not their own profit that they were distributing away. It was, if anything, taxpayers and depositors and shareholders' money. So really, banks are very special types of organizations. They're not like any ordinary companies, like a car manufacturer, because everything is in that balance sheet. The balance sheet of the banks really depends on the quality of assets. And if you just look at the balance sheet and you don't look in depth into the quality of those assets, the quality of those loans, the quality of those bank investments, you're missing a lot. And I'm afraid financial regulation in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been not looking deeply enough into what banks were actually doing, and relying excessively on supposedly the bank's own ways of calculating capital requirements and calculating risk, etc. Because supposedly regulators were not able to calculate risks. Banks were able to calculate them a lot more effectively, and we've seen what has happened. Of course, lots of explanations of what has caused the crisis. I mean, some people say it's failures of regulation. I think that's a tautology, if you like, if I'm allowed this expression, because there can't be no financial crisis without a failure of regulation. And regulators are there in order to prevent financial crisis. So if there is a financial crisis, there must have been a failure of regulation. So you can't have one without the other. The more important question is, why have we had these failures in regulation, right? Did the regulators not understand what was going on with the banking systems around the world? Did they understand and they didn't act? Did the politicians know what was going on? These are the kind of questions that we don't have a huge amount of evidence on. But I think they are the most important questions. If I may speculate a lot on them, and in fact some people have written on them, people like Simon Johnson, who used to be until recently the chief economist of the IMF. And the story there is one where there's been a great good party for those who are involved, right? In the last 10 to 15 years, the bankers had a great party, and in that party there was also the politicians and the regulators. And they were all having a good time, and you can see that. Who are the regulators? The regulators are, in reality, and in most countries in the world, they are the bankers. They are ex-bankers. I mean, it's very hard to find a regulator who is not an ex-banker or is not a future banker, right? So there is this kind of merry-go-round. So the ex-bankers are regulating the current bankers, and then the current regulators become the next round of bankers, etc. So regulators and politicians who are kind of blessing all this party as it was going on, and were benefiting from it, because politicians, successive US Treasury secretaries, for example, have come from the private sector, the banking system, Goldman Sachs in particular, but also other companies. So they had little interest to stop the party while it was going on, and if anything, they allowed it to continue, and many politicians ended up in sharing the proceeds from the party alongside the bankers and alongside the regulators. So it was a great party while it was lasting. Unfortunately, the party has ended now, and the rest of the world has been asked to pay. And it's the rest of the world, the taxpayers in the United States, the taxpayers in Britain, the taxpayers in Europe and all over the world, the poor in the developing countries, and the unemployed all over the world. Everyone has to pay now towards that party. That's the world we live in. There's been a lot of talk of green shoots of recovery, and I think the hope by many of those who are making those statements is that we will quickly forget about the crisis. We will quickly forget what caused the crisis. And then we will not demand, the electorate and the taxpayers around the world will not demand fundamental reform. Because I fear that the same people who have caused the crisis have just moved around. It's a game of musical chairs, if you like. And there's been a lot of resistance to doing anything fundamental, to regulate, for example, the city bonuses, right? To change that culture. Even though there's been a lot of talk about it, and it's good that we have had a discussion on that, but there doesn't seem to be the appetite for action. There doesn't seem to be appetite for action in the regulators, in particular, in the industrialized world, and there isn't much appetite for change at the international level, even though we have reports that are suggesting fundamental reforms to the IMF. They're not being taken up. So I think the people who have a vested interest in the situation to continue are doing their best for the problem to go away, so that we don't really take the action that is necessary. But I'm afraid to say that that action has not been taken so far. I would like to see it to be taken. I would like to see more effective regulators around the world, and I would like to see international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank that are actually working hard to alleviate poverty and to help developing countries and to promote international financial stability. But I don't think we've seen enough yet. Why should we be bailing out banks? I think that the politicians had no alternative, if you like, but to bail them out, because not having a banking system, if the system was paralyzed, the situation would have been a lot worse for all of us. And what it would have meant, we would not have had a payment system, credit would have frozen for a longer, etc. Now, bailing out the banks doesn't mean bailing out the bankers. And this is where the unfairness is, I think, right? Allowing the banks to continue, I mean, the average person who works in the bank was not responsible for the crisis. They shouldn't necessarily lose their job. Most of the shareholders actually, in fact, were not responsible for this. So who has been responsible has been the chief executives of the banks, senior management of the banks, and the people who were really gambling with other people's money. Now, I think that it's unfair to bail out those sorts of people, right? Now, bailing out the banks themselves, as I said, it's the only alternative that politicians had. It had to happen. But what is not acceptable, I think, is for the people who caused the crisis, and they're not necessarily the bank shareholders, they are the chief executives of the banks, to be getting away with it so lightly, to be getting away with big pensions in some cases, and in some other cases they're not even losing their jobs or anything. And you have to remember that these people, they lose their jobs, they're not really poor, right? Because they have amassed millions in the good years, and they have, and that money is already there for them, and would give them a very comfortable retirement. So in no way are we seeing a punishment of the bankers that have led to this crisis, and the taxpayers are being punished without really causing the crisis. I think what went on there is weak corporate governance within banks. Besides weak regulation, we have had weak corporate governance, and that goes back to the economic underpinnings, if you like, of banking. The main issue there is the issue of what we call asymmetric information. So if you look at the bank balance sheet, or if you look at any kind of financial transaction, there is this information is not distributed equally among the parties in the transaction. That's what we call asymmetric information. Now, in simpler terms, perhaps it's what we call opaqueness, right? Opaqueness of financial products. So you're looking at the assets of the bank, and if you're an outsider, you really don't know how good they are, and you don't know what kind of risks are involved in those assets. And if you have a set of accounts that says, oh, we made a great profit this year, everything is fine, then no one is going to rock the boat. So what we need to kind of know is whether those accounts are a true representation and whether they tell us enough about the risks that the banks were taking. And clearly they were not. And because those accounts were not telling us enough about the risks, and the regulators were not telling us enough about the risks, lots of people like shareholders, etc., were sleeping, if you like, comfortably, because they thought that their shares were safe and their money was safe in the banks. But in fact, that was not the case. So it's all an issue of information, if you like. So not there being enough transparency in the bank's balance sheets, not there being enough transparency in what the regulators were doing, etc. The nature of banking is such that it allows banks to get away with not disclosing enough information. Now, tougher regulation will be regulation that makes banks disclose a lot more than they have been. We have had the so-called notion of market discipline. Well, the market hasn't really disciplined the banks. That notion of market discipline, which was in the Basel II Accord, simply has not worked. And that has not worked because the information that banks were disclosing was not sufficient to show the markets that these banks were taking excessive risks. So information is indeed a very, very big and important issue. Now, you also asked about corruption, and corruption that is being criticized when it's happening in developing countries, but we don't hear enough of it in industrialized countries. I think it would be very surprising if that problem of corruption is only in the developing countries. I think it's clear that what we have seen with the financial crisis cannot be described otherwise. If politicians are ending up on the boards of these companies and earning millions of dollars, of these banks I should say, right? It may be legal, but I'm not sure it can be described as a good practice, right? As good governance. If the people who are supposed to regulate the banks and they don't, and then when their term of office as politicians or regulators they end up on the boards of these financial institutions and earn millions of dollars. I don't know what you want to call it, but I'm sure some people would call it corruption.